At our anniversary dinner, my husband raised a toast and laughed, 5 years wasted on a worthless nobody. The guests chuckled until I slid a folder across the table. Funny, I said, because this forged prenup means you get nothing. And those texts with your partner's sister? They just went to everyone you know. The lawyers arrived with divorce papers before dessert. But the real surprise. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know which city you're joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. Now, let me take you into this story. My name is Eleanor, and I need to share something that happened. It's a story about a 5-year marriage, a carefully crafted illusion, and the night that illusion came crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. It's a story about being underestimated. And let me tell you, people will underestimate you right up until the moment you show them exactly who you are. For 5 years, I was Mrs. Preston Coleman. To the outside world, we were the perfect couple. He was the brilliant, charismatic businessman, the man who could command a boardroom with a single glance. And I was Ellie. Quiet, bookish Ellie, with a literature degree and a penchant for classic novels. Preston loved to tell people I lived in fictional worlds. It was part of his narrative about me, the charming little story he told at dinner parties and corporate events. You wouldn't get it, Ellie, he'd say, ruffling my hair as he discussed a complex merger over the breakfast table, the condescension in his voice a familiar, dull ache. Your literature degree is great for reading bedtime stories, but this is real business. And I would just smile. I played my part perfectly. For 5 years, I maintained this meticulously crafted persona, the supportive, simple wife who had traded her academic ambitions for domestic bliss. Our home was his castle, and I was just another beautiful, simple fixture within it. My bookshelves, filled with Faulkner and Austen and Wharton, served as the perfect prop for his story about me. He saw them not as a collection of profound human insights, but as evidence of a woman who couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of his financial empire. A woman who would never question, never pry, never understand. And that, right there, was his first mistake. It was a fatal one. What Preston failed to recognize was that my love of literature had taught me everything I needed to know. It taught me to observe, to analyze patterns in behavior, and to recognize the subtle foreshadowing of a man's true character. It taught me that the most compelling villains are often the ones who believe themselves to be the heroes of their own story. And it taught me that eventually, every story has a turning point. At our anniversary dinner, our 5th anniversary, my husband raised a toast in a room full of our friends and business associates. He smiled that handsome, confident smile of his and laughed. 5 years, he said, his voice carrying across the silent, elegant dining room. 5 years wasted on a worthless nobody. The guests gave a few polite, uncomfortable chuckles. They thought it was a joke, a poorly timed but harmless jab. They kept chuckling until I slid a simple manila folder across the polished mahogany table toward him. Funny, I said, my voice clear and steady. Because this forged prenup means you get nothing. The chuckles died in their throats. And those texts with your partner's sister? I continued, holding up my phone. They just went to everyone you know. The lawyers, you see, were scheduled to arrive with the divorce papers before dessert was even served. But that wasn't the real surprise. The real surprise was what he never, ever saw coming. It didn't start with a plan for revenge. Honestly, it started with hurt. In the early days of our marriage, the dismissiveness was subtle. A patronizing smile when I'd ask about his workday. The way he'd simplify explanations about his company's finances as though he were speaking to a child. It's just some corporate restructuring, honey. Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. I noticed. Of course, I noticed. But I also noticed something more valuable. When he truly believed I wasn't intellectually equipped to understand, he stopped hiding things. It was a gradual erosion of caution, born from his own arrogance. He'd leave his briefcase open on the study floor, confidential papers peeking out. He'd take calls on speakerphone, pacing our living room while discussing creative accounting methods with his partners. I'd just be there in the corner, curled up with a book, seemingly lost in another world. I became invisible wallpaper in my own home. The first time it really clicked, the first time I moved from being a passive observer to an active collector, was about 3 years into our marriage. He was at our kitchen island, laughing into his phone. "Of course, she doesn't understand the Thompson deal," he snorted. "She thinks it's just some corporate reshuffling. The woman reads Jane Austen for fun. She's not exactly equipped to spot a shell company." I was at the stove, stirring a risotto, my back to him. He never saw the way my hand tightened on the wooden spoon, the knuckles turning white. He never saw the slight, almost imperceptible nod I gave to myself. Shell company. I filed the term away, searing it into my memory. That night, after he was asleep, I went to my little reading nook, but instead of opening a novel, I opened my laptop. I created a new, anonymous email account. My first saved document was a simple text file, the Thompson deal. Possible shell company. Initially, it was just a way to prove to myself that I wasn't as simple as he believed. It was my own private rebellion. I had no grand plan for the information. I just couldn't bear the thought of being as ignorant as he assumed. I started taking pictures. A document left on his desk here, a page of a ledger there. My phone, which he saw as a device for social media and online shopping, became my greatest tool. With my back turned, pretending to text my sister, Lorraine, I'd be positioning my phone, recording his condescending explanations about falsifying business expenses. "You have to understand, Ellie, sometimes for the greater good of the company, you have to move assets around in creative ways. It's a bit like a tax write-off, but more complex," he'd say, convinced he was dazzling me with his business acumen. He never noticed the quiet click of my phone locking, the recording safely saved. I would transcribe the conversations later that night, my literature degree finally proving useful in ways Preston never anticipated. Years of analyzing text had trained my memory to capture dialogue with remarkable precision. I developed a system, record what I could, then expand the transcripts with detailed context and observations, noting his tone, his body language, the specific words he chose. This went on for months. My secret email account became a digital archive of Preston's hubris. It was a collection of whispers, boasts, and casual confessions made in front of a woman he had already dismissed. By our 4th anniversary, Preston's carelessness had become routine. It was no longer just a slip-up here and there, it was a fundamental part of his behavior around me. He had so thoroughly convinced himself of my intellectual simplicity that he operated with no filter. The financial documents weren't just left out anymore, they were stacked on the corner of the dining table, a place he knew I cleaned every day. "Just push those aside if you need to, honey," he'd say, "it's just some boring quarterly reports." Boring wasn't the word I'd use. I learned the names of his partners, his accountants, and his offshore holding companies. I learned that aggressive tax strategy was his favorite euphemism for tax evasion. While he was in the shower, I would lay the documents out on the floor, my phone camera working silently, capturing page after page of incriminating evidence. I learned to be quick, efficient, and to leave no trace. I'd put everything back exactly as I found it, down to the angle of the paperclip on a stack of invoices. His business calls became more and more brazen. He'd have his closest partner, Donovan, over for drinks in our living room. They'd sit there, swirling expensive scotch in their glasses, discussing how to hide profits from a recent real estate deal while I was just a few feet away, folding laundry. "Are you sure we should be talking about this here?" I once heard Donovan ask, his voice a low murmur as he gestured vaguely in my direction. Preston let out a booming laugh. The sound echoed off the high ceilings of the room he was so proud of. "Donovan, relax. Don't worry about her," he said, loud enough for me to hear clearly. "Ellie's too busy thinking about her book club to understand what we're doing." I folded a towel with meticulous care, my movements smooth and unhurried. Inside, a cold, hard knot was forming in my stomach. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was something else, something sharper. It was calculation. I started to see the patterns. The way money would flow into one subsidiary, only to be transferred to another, then another, before ending up in an account in the Cayman Islands. I didn't need a business degree to see that it was a shell game, designed to confuse and obscure. My literary analysis skills, the very thing he mocked, made me exceptionally good at spotting patterns and inconsistencies. When numbers repeatedly appeared in his documents that seemed at odds with what he claimed publicly, I didn't need an accounting degree to flag the discrepancy. I just needed patience and attention to detail, qualities Preston had always dismissed as the fussy habits of a bookish woman. One evening, I was dusting his home office, a task he found fitting for me. He was on the phone with his accountant. "Listen," he instructed, his feet propped up on his expensive mahogany desk. "Just move the Henderson payments through the Cayman account first. The IRS doesn't have the manpower to track every international transfer. Besides, technically, it's not illegal if we route it through the consulting subsidiary first." That night, my transcription was verbatim. My secret archive was growing, becoming less of a personal diary and more of a legal dossier. And still, I had no endgame. I was just a woman adrift, collecting the wreckage of her marriage piece by painful piece. I thought his financial crimes were the worst of it. I was wrong. The real betrayal, the one that would give my mission a purpose, was still to come. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday, 14 months ago. The kind of gray, dreary day that seems to seep into your bones. Preston had left for a golf game, one of his many networking events. He'd left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he took a quick shower before leaving. I was wiping down the granite, the scent of lemon cleaner in the air, when the screen lit up. A notification appeared. A message from someone named Sabrina. The preview showed just enough. 3 little words that shattered my world. "Last night was amazing." My hands started to tremble. The dishcloth fell from my grasp onto the floor. I told myself not to look. I told myself to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. It was like a magnet, pulling me in. With a shaking finger, I clicked the message. And there she was. Sabrina. The younger sister of his business partner, Donovan. The woman who hugged me at every family gathering, who told me how lucky I was to have Preston. The woman who had, apparently, been sleeping with my husband. I scrolled through months of messages, each one a fresh stab of betrayal. They were intimate, disrespectful, and filled with a shared contempt for me. Sabrina, is she suspicious at all? Preston, not a chance. She doesn't suspect a thing. Too busy with her books to notice the real world around her. Sabrina, I felt so bad at the charity gala, having to pretend with her. Preston, don't. It's just a role we play. You were amazing tonight, by the way. Sabrina, can't wait to see you again when she's visiting her parents next month. The words blurred through a haze of tears. It wasn't just the affair. It was the mockery. The confirmation that in my own home, in my own marriage, I was the punchline to a cruel joke. The man I had shared a bed with for 5 years saw me as nothing more than a convenient, oblivious fool. I sank into a kitchen chair, the cold of the leather seeping through my clothes. For a few minutes, I just sat there, hollowed out. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. I thought about screaming. I thought about throwing his laptop against the wall. I thought about packing a bag and just leaving, disappearing from the life that had turned out to be a lie. But then, another feeling started to creep in, pushing past the pain. It was a cold, sharp, clarifying anger. My trembling stopped. The tears dried on my face. I stood up, went back to the laptop, and started taking screenshots. Everything. Every loving emoji, every secret plan, every single word that mocked me. I added them to my growing collection of evidence, creating a new folder in my secret email account simply titled Betrayal. I returned the computer exactly as I'd found it, closing the message window. When Preston emerged from the shower, smelling of expensive soap and oblivious betrayal, I greeted him with the same warm, gentle smile I'd perfected over 5 years. "Have a good game, honey," I said, kissing his cheek. "I will," he said, patting my head like one might a dog. "Don't wait up." But as I watched him walk out the door, something fundamental had changed within me. My documentation was no longer just about wounded pride or proving a point to myself. It had become ammunition. And I was going to find out exactly how to use it. 2 days later, my hands were still shaking slightly as I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. I had to look it up in my old college alumni directory. Audra Blackwell. We hadn't been close friends, more like acquaintances who shared a few political science classes. But I remembered her being sharp, direct, and fiercely intelligent. The directory listed her as a partner at a downtown law firm, specializing in divorce and financial crimes. It was perfect. Our coffee meetup appeared casual to anyone watching, just 2 old friends catching up after a decade. We met at a small, independent coffee shop, the kind with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. I got there early, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I picked a table in the corner, a place where we wouldn't be easily overheard. "Ellie. My God, you haven't changed a bit," Audra said, her smile genuine as she slid into the chair opposite me. She looked formidable, dressed in a sharp blazer, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. We made small talk for a few minutes, college memories, mutual acquaintances, the rising cost of living. It was excruciating. Finally, I took a deep breath. "Listen, Audra," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is going to sound a little strange, but I'm outlining a novel. And the main character is in a very complicated marriage." Audra raised an eyebrow, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips. "A novel. Right. Go on." I spent the next hour carefully testing the waters, asking hypothetical questions. What if, I'd say, a character suspected her husband was hiding assets? What kind of proof would she need, or hypothetically, if a prenup was signed, what could possibly invalidate it? I was specific. I asked about recording conversations, about financial disclosure laws, about the legality of accessing documents in a shared home. Audra answered each question with professional precision, her eyes never leaving my face. I could tell she didn't believe the novel story for a second, but she played along. "It's for a character in a novel I'm outlining," I explained again when she raised an eyebrow at my very specific questions about forensic accounting and shell companies. "This character of yours," Audra said, stirring her latte slowly. "She seems to be in a lot of trouble. Make sure she has a good lawyer." That first coffee meeting turned into a second, then a third. Our occasional coffee dates evolved into strategic planning sessions disguised as friendly gatherings. I maintained the pretense of creative research for months, and Audra, to her credit, never pushed me to admit what we were really discussing. She understood the need for discretion. She let me move at my own pace. It wasn't until I showed her a particularly damning transcript of Preston discussing how to hide a recent inheritance from his uncle to avoid it being considered marital property that she finally closed her notebook and looked at me directly. The cafe was buzzing around us, but it felt like we were in our own little bubble. "Ellie," she said, her voice low and serious. "Let's drop the novel pretense for a minute. If you have this kind of evidence, you need to be very, very careful about how and when you use it." I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight. "Some of what you've described goes beyond grounds for divorce," she continued, her gaze intense. "We're talking potential criminal charges. We're talking about the IRS. This is bigger than you think." That conversation shifted everything. The dam broke, and I told her everything, the condescension, the financial documents, the affair with Sabrina. I told her about the secret email account, the years of quiet documentation. I expected judgment, or maybe pity. Instead, I saw a flicker of something else in Audra's eyes, respect. "Okay," she said, pulling her notebook back out. "Let's get to work." With Audra now fully on board, my scattered collection of evidence began to transform into a coherent legal strategy. She helped me organize everything, explaining what would matter in divorce proceedings and what might interest federal authorities. She was meticulous, patient, and ruthless in her analysis. "The recordings are good," she'd say, tapping a transcript. "One-party consent is legal in the state, so they're admissible. The photos of the documents are even better. But we need to connect the dots. We need a professional." She connected me with a forensic accountant named Mr. Gable, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 60s with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. Under the guise of helping with research for my book, he analyzed the patterns in Preston's financial documents that I had been collecting. I'd meet him in quiet corners of the public library, passing him a thumb drive loaded with scanned documents and spreadsheets I'd created. A few weeks later, he called me for a meeting with Audra. The three of us sat in her sterile, quiet conference room, the city skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Mr. Gable laid out a series of charts and documents on the large mahogany table. "It's worse than we thought," he said, his voice grave. "It's not just aggressive tax avoidance. This is systematic fraud. He's created at least 3 shell companies to launder money, he's falsifying invoices for services never rendered, and his charitable donations are inflated by at least 200%. Audra nodded slowly, her expression grim. "We have him on tax evasion, wire fraud." "There's more," Mr. Gable interrupted, pushing a document across the table. "I had a look at the prenuptial agreement you sent over, Mrs. Coleman. It was a copy of the prenup I had signed 5 years ago, a document I had barely understood at the time. Preston had assured me it was just a formality, a way to protect his family's business. I had signed it without a second thought, eager to prove I wasn't after his money." "The document you signed was fair," Mr. Gable explained, pointing to a specific clause. "It guaranteed you a significant lump sum in alimony in the event of a divorce. However, the version filed with the court is different." He laid a second document next to the first. At first glance, they looked identical. But Mr. Gable pointed out the subtle differences. The font on one page was a fraction of a point smaller. The spacing between 2 paragraphs was slightly different. And nestled within that altered spacing was a new clause, one that effectively left me with nothing. It stated that in the event of a divorce due to infidelity, on either party's part, all assets would revert to their original owner. Given Sabrina, it was a perfectly crafted trap. "The manipulation was clever," Audra said, her voice filled with cold fury. "Not obvious enough to be immediately detectable, but clear once someone knew to look for it. The metadata on the file shows it was altered 2 days after you signed it." I stared at the 2 documents, my blood running cold. He hadn't just planned to control me during the marriage, he had planned my destitution after it ended. He had forged a legal document to ensure I would walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back. Audra reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "This isn't just unethical, Ellie," she said, her voice firm. "It's a felony. It's fraud. And it invalidates the entire agreement." In that moment, any lingering doubt, any shred of sentimentality I might have had for the man I married, evaporated. This wasn't just about an affair or financial greed. This was about a fundamental, calculated cruelty that I could no longer ignore. He hadn't just underestimated me, he had planned to destroy me. And I knew then that I would not let that happen. The game had changed. Now, it was about more than just getting a fair divorce settlement. It was about justice. For the next several months, I lived a double life that required an Oscar-worthy performance. On the surface, I was the perfect, oblivious wife. I hosted dinner parties, smiled at Preston's terrible jokes, and listened patiently to his self-aggrandizing stories. I complimented his new suits and made sure his favorite single malt scotch was always stocked. I played my part so well that even I sometimes forgot it was an act. But beneath the surface, I was a woman preparing for war. My coffee dates with Audra became intense, clandestine strategy sessions. We mapped out every step, every contingency. The element of surprise is our greatest weapon, she told me. He can't have a single clue this is coming. The moment he suspects, he'll start moving assets and destroying evidence. So, I perfected my performance. While secretly preparing for the moment I would shatter the illusion completely, I made small, calculated moves. I purchased several small, undetectable recording devices online, the kind that look like USB drives or pens. I started leaving them in his home office, in the living room, even in his car. The evidence I gathered became richer, more damning. I caught him on tape coaching his CFO on how to cook the books for a quarterly filing. I recorded a call where he laughed about creating a fake consulting fee to write off a lavish vacation with Sabrina. I backed up every piece of evidence in multiple locations, a secure cloud server, encrypted thumb drives stored in a safe deposit box under my maiden name, and even one I mailed to my sister Lorraine with strict instructions not to open it unless she heard from me. I learned the specific legal terms for each of Preston's financial transgressions. I could now casually discuss the difference between a tax write-off and tax evasion, between a subsidiary and a shell company. I was no longer just collecting data, I was building a case. And then, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Our 5th anniversary. Preston, in his infinite arrogance, insisted on hosting an elaborate celebration at Harlow's, the most upscale and exclusive restaurant in the city. We have to maintain appearances, Ellie, he'd said. It's important for business. He'd invited 40 guests, mostly his business associates and their wives, with a sprinkling of my family members to make it look legitimate. The invitations had gone out weeks ago, embossed with gold lettering that read, 5 years of partnership and success. As I traced the raised letters with my fingertip, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. 5 years of partnership and success indeed, just not the kind Preston was celebrating. The night before the dinner, I laid out my outfit. A sophisticated navy dress, elegant and understated. Preston had once called it suitable for a faculty wife, a backhanded compliment if I ever heard one. I would wear it as my armor. I placed Audra's business card in my small evening clutch, alongside a small, silver thumb drive. That tiny piece of metal contained 5 years of his lies, his crimes, and his betrayals. It was the key to his downfall. In the morning, before getting ready, I would make one final move. I would contact the IRS's whistleblower office with a carefully prepared report, complete with an organized summary and links to the digital evidence. The clock was ticking. The ticking clock on our bedroom wall seemed to count down the hours until our anniversary dinner, each tick a step closer to the end of my old life and the beginning of my new one. Tomorrow, Preston would stand before our friends and family, glass raised in a toast to our marriage, and I would finally stop playing the role of the simple, tolerant wife he had forced me to become. The morning of our anniversary dawned with an unusual serenity. My hands should have trembled as I applied my makeup, but they remained steady. 5 years of practice had perfected my composure. I had already sent the encrypted email to the IRS whistleblower program at dawn. The first shot had been fired, though he'd never hear the sound. Preston had already left for the office, promising to meet me directly at Harlow's. I've arranged everything, he'd said, kissing my forehead with the detached affection one might show a child. Just show up looking pretty. That was all I was to him. An accessory. A pretty object to have on his arm. I arrived at Harlow's precisely 30 minutes early. The restaurant gleamed under soft, ambient lighting. The maitre d' recognized me immediately, his smile professionally warm. Mrs. Coleman, a pleasure. Your husband has arranged a beautiful evening. The Magnolia Room is ready for you. I followed him through the bustling main dining area to the private room Preston had reserved. It was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over a large, horseshoe-shaped table adorned with white roses and gleaming silver accents. Place cards with elegant calligraphy marked each setting. Preston and I were positioned at the center of the curve, like a king and queen holding court. I made a slow circuit of the table, memorizing the seating arrangement. It was a map of his world. His most important business partners, including Donovan, were clustered to his right. His sycophantic friends to his left. My family, my sister Lorraine and her husband, were relegated to the far ends of the table, almost an afterthought. It was a perfect physical representation of my place in his life. There was a small, antique side table near my seat, intended for a lady's purse. I opened its single drawer. Empty. My manila folder, the one containing the side-by-side comparison of the prenuptial agreements, slid perfectly inside. Out of sight, but within easy reach. I checked my phone one last time. Audra had confirmed via text she and her 2 associates would arrive precisely at 9 p.m. The mass text message, containing the screenshots of Preston's affair, was queued up in a drafts folder, ready to be sent to every guest in the room with a single command. 5 years of calculated tolerance would end tonight. Guests began arriving at 7. Preston's parents entered first. His mother, a woman perpetually draped in pearls and disapproval, embraced me with the practiced affection of someone who had always viewed me as a sensible, if uninspired, choice for her son. "You look lovely, dear," she said, her eyes already scanning the room for more important people to greet. Preston's father merely nodded, his attention fixed on the well-stocked bar. My sister Lorraine arrived with her husband, and she immediately sensed my tension. She was the only person in the world who could see past my carefully constructed facade. "Are you okay, Ellie?" she whispered as she hugged me tight. "You seem different." I squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I'm fine. Tonight's going to be a memorable night." I gave her a small, secret smile, and she looked at me, puzzled but trusting. She was the only person in that room who might have detected the steel beneath my smile. Finally, at 7:30, Preston made his grand entrance, surrounded by his 3 closest business associates, all of them laughing at some shared joke. He looked handsome in his tailored Italian suit, radiating the unshakable confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His eyes found mine across the room, and he offered the same indulgent smile he'd given me for years. Affectionate, but dismissive. "There's my beautiful wife," he announced, his voice booming as he crossed the room to kiss my cheek. "Always punctual, always perfect." His hand lingered possessively at the small of my back as he leaned in to whisper, "I've arranged for the Thompson account to be finalized tonight. Donovan's here and will sign after dinner." I nodded appreciatively, a perfect picture of a supportive wife. "That's wonderful, dear." I knew, of course, that the Thompson account was one of his more creative tax evasion vehicles. Another piece of evidence already documented, reported, and waiting to detonate. The stage was set. All the actors were in place. And soon, the curtain would rise on the final act. Dinner progressed with practiced elegance. The clinking of silverware against fine china, the low hum of polite conversation, the attentive dance of the waitstaff, it was a perfect picture of success and civility. I played my role, maintaining the gentle, passive smile I had worn for 5 years. I asked the right questions about children and vacations, I laughed at the appropriate moments, and I nodded along to conversations I was never truly a part of. Preston grew increasingly animated with each glass of expensive champagne. His hand would occasionally pat my thigh beneath the table in a gesture of proprietary ownership, while above the table, he largely ignored me, holding court with his business partners. He was in his element, the master of his universe, completely unaware that his universe was about to implode. Between the main course and dessert, Preston's partner, Donovan, clinked his glass with a spoon, the sound cutting through the chatter. "If I could have everyone's attention," he said with a broad smile. "I think it's time for a toast to the happy couple." A wave of applause rippled through the room. Preston stood, champagne flute in hand, a smug, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. The room quieted as everyone turned their attention toward him. His smile carried that familiar, cruel edge, the one that appeared when he felt particularly clever. "Thank you, Donovan." Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice smooth and confident. 5 years. 5 years ago, I made what my friends called the safest bet of my career. He paused, letting a few appreciative chuckles ripple through his inner circle. Marriage, he continued, gesturing toward me with his glass. Marriage to the quiet literature professor who was more interested in fictional worlds than the real one around her. I maintained my smile, a perfect, serene mask, as murmurs of discomfort began to spread through some of the guests. I could see my sister Lorraine's knuckles turn white as she gripped her wine glass. My colleagues, Preston went on, his voice dripping with false modesty, they warned me that marrying someone so academically focused might be challenging for a man in my position. He gestured expansively around the room. But I saw what they didn't. I saw a woman who would never question my business decisions. A woman who would be content with the lifestyle I provided while staying safely in her lane. The room had grown awkwardly silent now. Even his closest friends looked uncomfortable. Preston, however, was too caught up in his own performance to notice. He was building to his grand finale. He raised his glass higher, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on me, cold and triumphant. So, here's to 5 years, he concluded, his voice ringing with a laugh that failed to disguise the cruelty beneath the words. 5 years wasted on a worthless nobody. A few shocked gasps were audible. He tried to save it, adding quickly, who knew that my simple wife would be my greatest asset. The polite, forced chuckles that followed held more discomfort than humor. My sister's face had flushed with a deep, furious red. Even Preston's mother looked embarrassed by her son's crass display. He sat down, looking pleased with himself, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just handed me the perfect opening. He had just confirmed, in front of 40 witnesses, exactly how he saw me. He had provided the motive for everything that was about to happen. I quietly reached down and opened the drawer of the side table. My fingers closed around the cool, smooth surface of the manila folder. The moment had arrived. The performance was over. As Preston sat down, basking in the awkward silence he had created, I stood up. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. The scrape of my chair against the polished hardwood floor seemed impossibly loud in the stunned room. I'd like to respond to that lovely toast, I said. My voice didn't waver. It carried clearly, calmly, to every corner of the room. Preston's smirk remained fixed in place. He looked amused, as if a pet had just learned a new, surprising trick. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing for me to proceed. By all means, honey. The floor is yours. It's true that I've been quiet these 5 years, I began, my eyes meeting his. I held the manila folder in my hand. But not for the reasons you think. His expression shifted slightly, a flicker of confusion in his eyes as he glanced at the folder. What's this, Ellie? An anniversary gift? Perhaps save it for later. Oh, but it can't wait, I replied, my voice still sweet, but now with an undercurrent of steel he had never heard before. I took a step forward and slid the folder across the table. It came to a neat stop directly in front of his plate. It's funny you should mention assets, I said, my voice dropping just a little, because this forged prenup, the one you altered after I signed it, means you actually get nothing from our divorce. The word divorce hung in the air, electric and sharp. The color drained from Preston's face. His smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. With a trembling hand, he flipped open the folder. Inside, laid out in undeniable clarity, was the evidence. The first page was a side-by-side comparison of the original prenuptial agreement he had given me and the fraudulent version he had filed with the court. The added clauses were highlighted in bright yellow. The second page was a detailed report from Mr. Gable, the forensic accountant, complete with documentation of the altered metadata, proving the file had been changed 2 days after I had signed the original. It was irrefutable. What is this? He hissed, his voice a low, strangled whisper. This is insane. Is it? I countered, my composure absolute. It looks like fraud to me. A felony, I believe. Around the table, people were leaning in, whispering urgently. Donovan, his partner, looked from the folder to Preston's ashen face with growing alarm. He had co-signed the original document as a witness. He was implicated. Preston looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and panic. For the first time in 5 years, he was seeing me. Not the simple, bookish wife, but the woman who had just dismantled his first line of defense with a single manila folder. He had no idea that this was just the beginning. As Preston stared, dumbfounded, at the evidence of his own forgery, I took out my phone. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. And speaking of assets, I continued, my voice as calm as a frozen lake, and liabilities. I held up my phone, my thumb hovering over the send button of the pre-written text message. My eyes locked with Preston's. In them, I saw dawning horror as he began to realize what was happening. Those texts with your partner's sister, Sabrina, I said, making sure to glance briefly at Donovan, whose face went pale. They just went to everyone in this room. I pressed send. As if choreographed, a symphony of chimes, dings, and buzzes erupted throughout the private dining room. 40 phones, almost in unison, lit up with the same notification. Guests reached for them reflexively, confusion turning to shock as they viewed the evidence of Preston's long-running affair. The explicit messages, the photos, the plans for their secret getaways, it was all there, dated and time-stamped. A woman near the end of the table gasped audibly. Donovan snatched his phone, his eyes widening as he scrolled. He looked at his wife, then at Preston, his face a mask of fury and betrayal. "What have you done?" Preston hissed, half rising from his seat, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Exactly what you never expected me to do," I answered calmly, my voice cutting through the rising chaos. I paid attention. The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly from awkward silence to open pandemonium. Preston's mother was staring at her phone in horror, her hand covering her mouth. His father looked away in disgust, shaking his head slowly. Donovan's wife had burst into tears. My sister, Lorraine, had moved to stand behind me, her hand resting supportively on my shoulder. "You've misunderstood," Preston began, looking desperately around the table, searching for an ally in a room that had suddenly turned hostile. "Those messages are old, they're fake." "They're dated and time-stamped," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "With your location data attached. Interesting how often you were working late at Sabrina's apartment building, isn't it?" Donovan had already moved several seats away from Preston, as if proximity alone was toxic. He was now studying the prenup documentation I had passed him with growing concern. "Preston, is this true?" he demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "Did you falsify legal documents? Did you do this with my sister?" Preston just stammered, speechless. He had lost control of the narrative, of the room, of his entire life, in the span of less than 5 minutes. His carefully constructed world of lies and deceit was being torn apart, text by text, in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. And standing at the center of the storm, calm and unshakable, was the worthless nobody he had just toasted. Before Preston could even begin to formulate a response, the grand wooden doors to the private dining room swung open. 3 figures stood silhouetted in the doorway. A woman in a sharp, impeccably tailored suit stood in the center, a leather briefcase in her hand. Flanking her were 2 younger associates, their expressions neutral and professional. It was Audra. Right on time. "Ah, perfect timing," I said, my voice ringing out in the chaotic room, drawing everyone's attention. Audra's heels clicked confidently across the hardwood floor as she approached our table. The restaurant, beyond our private room, had fallen eerily silent. Even the soft classical music seemed to have faded away, as if holding its breath. Preston's face contorted, twisting from fury to disbelief as he recognized her. "You," he stammered, the pieces slowly, painfully clicking into place. "You're the tax attorney from the Children's Hospital Benefit Gala. We had attended it 6 months ago." I had made sure to introduce them. Audra offered him a polite, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. Among other specialties, yes. She placed her leather portfolio on the table, its lock clicking open with a sound of finality. The lawyers are here with the divorce papers, I announced to the room at large. I believe we're just in time for dessert. Audra slid a thick stack of documents across the table, not to Preston, but to me. I've prepared everything according to your instructions, Eleanor, she said, her voice clear and authoritative. All the evidence we discussed has been properly filed with the appropriate authorities. What authorities? Preston demanded, his voice cracking. Audra simply smiled. Preston lunged for the papers, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control, but Donovan, his former friend and partner, intercepted his arm. Don't make this worse, Preston, Donovan muttered, his own face ashen as he glanced between his crying wife and the prenup evidence. The trap had been sprung. He was surrounded, exposed, and utterly alone. His affair was public knowledge, his financial fraud was laid bare on the table, and my lawyer had just arrived to serve him divorce papers in the most humiliating way possible. He thought the worst was over. He had no idea. The legal justice I had set in motion was just the appetizer. The main course was yet to come. As Preston stood there, trapped and exposed, Audra continued, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a surgeon's scalpel. Is that so? She replied to his sputtering denials. She reached into her briefcase and removed another document. Perhaps you could explain the context of this recorded conversation from February 12th, when you instructed your CFO to cook the books for the quarterly filing? Or this email chain where you discuss creating fake invoices for services never rendered to the tune of $200,000? The last vestiges of color drained from Preston's face. You recorded me? He whispered, horrified. That's illegal. One-party consent is perfectly legal in this state, I said softly from my seat. It was the first thing Audra had taught me. Something you might have known if you'd ever bothered to listen when I mentioned the research for my novel about white-collar crime. The realization dawned on his face, a slow, sickening wave of understanding. My novel, I continued, was the perfect cover. For 2 years, I openly discussed fictional scenarios with you that mirrored your actual activities. I used your own arrogance to gauge your reactions and gather information on your understanding of legal boundaries. You unwittingly educated me on exactly which laws you were breaking, all while believing I was crafting an imaginary story. You were writing about me, he said, his voice cracked with indignation. Not initially, I admitted honestly. But you became such a compelling case study in financial fraud and classic narcissism that I couldn't resist. Just then, as if on cue, the dessert cart appeared in the doorway. A young server, oblivious to the drama, faltered as he sensed the tension in the room. Audra simply waved him in. Please, continue, she said smoothly. We're just concluding some business. Before the server could even offer us a selection, the restaurant's front doors burst open again. This time, it was Mitchell Davis, Preston's high-powered attorney, breathing heavily as if he'd run from his car. Preston! Don't sign anything, he commanded, rushing toward our table. Too late for that advice, Audra responded coolly. But your client might benefit from your counsel regarding the ongoing IRS investigation. What IRS investigation? Mitchell demanded, looking utterly bewildered. I met Preston's eyes directly across the table, across the ruins of our marriage. The one triggered by the whistleblower report I filed 3 months ago, I said clearly. All those evening phone calls when I said I was talking to my sister? I was building a case with the Financial Crimes Division. I documented your systematic tax evasion. I identified the shell companies you created to hide assets. I tracked the falsified charitable donations. Actually, I understood everything, Preston. I just never let you see that I did. The chocolate soufflé arrived at our table, the server placing it delicately between us, oblivious to the destruction happening around him. It deflated slightly in the center, much like Preston's illusion of control. Jeffrey, another of Preston's key business associates, stood up abruptly. "I need to distance myself from this situation immediately," he announced, gathering his coat. Several other associates followed suit, mumbling excuses and avoiding Preston's desperate gaze. "You can't just leave," Preston hissed. "We've worked together for years. You're involved in half of these deals." "That's exactly why I'm leaving," Jeffrey replied coldly. "And why you'll be hearing from my attorney tomorrow." As Preston watched his carefully constructed network disintegrate before his very eyes, his mother approached our table, her face rigid. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, she addressed me directly. "I'd like to understand exactly what's happening. Your son created fraudulent financial records, evaded taxes, manipulated legal documents," I explained gently. "And he's been having an affair with Donovan's sister for at least the past year." She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. She reached up, unclasped the stunning pearl necklace she was wearing, Preston's anniversary gift to her, and placed it on the table. "I believe this was purchased with company funds, not with my son's salary," she said. "It belongs to your case, not to him." Without another word, she collected her husband and departed, leaving Preston utterly, finally, alone. The room continued to empty out, guests fleeing the scene as if it were contaminated. The elegant anniversary dinner had devolved into a crisis management session, with former allies now treating each other as potential liabilities. As his world crumbled, Preston turned to me, his voice low and dangerous. "You spent 5 years planning this. Living a lie." "No, Preston," I corrected him calmly. "I spent 5 years married to a lie. Tonight, I'm finally telling the truth." His attorney, Mitchell, pulled him aside, their urgent whispers carrying just enough for me to catch fragments about damage control and preliminary injunctions. Across the room, I saw another of his college friends frantically deleting contacts from his phone. "I'm out, Preston," the friend announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The Davidson contract was bad enough, but this..." He gestured toward the evidence folder. "This could implicate all of us. I have a family. I'm not going down for you." As Preston watched another pillar of his world crumble, something shifted in his expression. The shock hardened into something darker. He straightened his tie and approached our table with a renewed, menacing purpose. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Privately." "I don't think that's necessary," Audra interjected smoothly. "Anything you have to say can be directed through legal channels from this point forward." "This doesn't concern you," Preston hissed, then turned his full attention to me. "Ellie, think about what you're doing. 5 years together means nothing to you? You're willing to destroy everything over some misunderstanding?" For a fleeting second, the familiar pattern nearly reasserted itself. His commanding tone, my anticipated submission. The muscle memory of deference twitched within me. Then I remembered his toast. 5 years wasted on a worthless nobody. "There's no misunderstanding, Preston," I replied, my voice steady as a rock. "And there's nothing to discuss." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think this little performance makes you powerful? I built everything we have. When this is over, you'll have nothing and no one." And then something unexpected happened. I laughed. Not the polite, accommodating laugh I'd perfected as Preston's wife, but a genuine, liberating sound that came from deep within my soul. "I already had nothing, Preston," I said, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. "You made sure of that with a forged prenup. The difference is, now I know my own worth." My straightened posture and direct gaze seemed to unnerve him more than any words could have. He had never seen this version of me. He had never seen the woman who wasn't performing. "You'll regret this," he threatened, but the effect was diminished by the tremor in his own voice. "I only regret not doing it sooner." Just then, his phone rang. The ringtone was a specific chime he used only for his executive assistant. He checked the screen, his face draining of what little color was left as he answered. What do you mean they're there now? His voice had lost its commanding edge, replaced by barely controlled panic. Don't let them access anything. Nothing. I'm on my way. He ended the call, looking around the room with fresh desperation. I need to go to the office. There's an emergency. What kind of emergency? His lawyer asked sharply. Federal agents, Preston admitted, his voice barely audible. Federal agents are at the building with some kind of warrant. The revelation rippled through the few remaining guests. Two more of his associates immediately made for the exit, practically running from what was clearly a sinking ship. For the first time since I'd known him, Preston looked truly, utterly lost. His carefully curated image was dissolving in real time, revealing the hollow, corrupt center beneath. Did you do this? He demanded, turning to me with naked fury. Did you call them? Audra shifted slightly, positioning herself between us. I believe I mentioned the whistleblower report earlier, Preston, she said calmly. Federal investigations don't happen overnight. This has been in motion for quite some time. As the full implications finally sank in, Preston grabbed his coat and rushed toward the exit. He nearly collided with the restaurant manager, who had appeared to check on the commotion. Sir, there are some men outside asking for you, the manager announced nervously. They said it's urgent. Preston froze mid-stride, trapped. For a fleeting moment, our eyes met across the room. And I saw something I'd never witnessed in him before. Pure, undiluted fear. The doors to the private room opened one last time. 3 men in dark, conservative suits entered, their expressions professionally neutral. The lead agent, a silver-haired man with piercing eyes, held up his credentials. Brian Coleman, he inquired, though his gaze had already locked onto Preston's frozen figure by the exit. That's him, someone volunteered unnecessarily. Mr. Coleman, the agent continued, his voice calm and authoritative, ignoring the lawyer who had stepped forward. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, and falsification of federal documents. You have the right to remain silent. The familiar Miranda warning echoed through the suddenly silent room. Preston's face contorted as he looked back at me, a dawning horror in his eyes. You, he whispered. What exactly did you tell them? Everything you told me, Preston, I said, my voice carrying across the room. Every conversation you had in front of your simple wife. Every document you left where I could find it. The second agent approached with handcuffs. Preston instinctively backed away. This is a mistake, he insisted, his voice rising. These are complex business matters. My wife couldn't possibly understand enough to. Actually, the lead agent interrupted, the evidence Mrs. Coleman provided was remarkably detailed and precise. In my 20 years with the Financial Crimes Division, I've rarely seen documentation this thorough from seasoned professionals, let alone a civilian. He then turned to me. Mrs. Coleman, if we could verify some final details? There are a few transactions we'd like to confirm. Preston watched in stunned silence as I discussed complex financial maneuvers with the agent, using terminology that he had always assumed was beyond my comprehension. The Davidson Shell Company was established in March, I explained clearly, but the fraudulent invoices didn't begin until after the Thompson restructuring in June. He keeps the original paperwork in his home office safe. The combination is 27-14-36. It's hidden behind the Monet reproduction. His attorney had gone pale. Stop talking, Preston. Not another word. But Preston wasn't listening. His eyes remained fixed on me. All this time, he said hoarsely. All those evenings when you were reading in the corner, all those dinner parties when you just smiled and nodded. I was paying attention, I said simply. Something you never bothered to do with me. The agents proceeded with the arrest, leading a shell-shocked Preston toward the door. As they passed our table, he paused, handcuffed wrists awkwardly positioned in front of him. Why? He asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Why go through with the anniversary dinner? Why the public humiliation? You could have just had them arrest me at the office. I considered his question carefully. Because you needed to understand what you'd done, I said, my voice soft but firm. Not just the financial crimes, but how you diminished me, how you disrespected me for years. Tonight wasn't just about legal justice, Preston. It was about finally being seen. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps the first glimmer of genuine understanding he'd ever had about me. Then the agents guided him toward the exit, and he was gone. The sound of the restaurant doors closing behind them echoed in the silent room. The storm was over. I just sat there, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade, leaving a strange, hollow calm in its wake. If you're still listening to me, if you've followed my story this far, would you do something for me? It would mean the world to me if you would just like this video and comment with the number 1 down below. It helps me know that you're out there, that you're listening, and that I'm not alone in this. Your support is a huge encouragement for me to keep sharing. So please, just comment with the number 1 so I can see you. And now, let me tell you what happened next. After Preston was led away, the remaining few guests began to disperse, murmuring in shocked tones, avoiding eye contact with me as if my victory was somehow contagious. The staff, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, began clearing the table, removing the half-eaten meals and the untouched anniversary cake. Audra collected her documents and approached my table, her professional demeanor softening. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. I took a deep, shuddering breath, assessing the hollow space where fear and anger had lived for so long. "I think I will be," I replied, surprised by the truth of it. The weight of 5 years of secrecy had finally been lifted. My sister Lorraine wrapped a warm, strong arm around my shoulders. "What happens now? Do you need a place to stay tonight? You can't go back to that house." I shook my head, a small, triumphant smile touching my lips for the first time that evening. "The house is in my name as of this afternoon," I told her. It was another detail Preston never bothered to read in the pile of boring investment papers I occasionally asked him to sign a few months ago. He thought he was just moving assets around for tax purposes. Audra smiled appreciatively at this final strategic move. "Nicely done, Ellie. The federal case will take months, possibly years. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been preparing for 5 years," I reminded her. "I can handle a few more months." As we gathered our things to leave, I paused at the table where Preston and I had sat side by side for the last time. The anniversary cake remained uncut, the decorative silver 5-topper now seeming like a different kind of countdown, one that had finally reached its conclusion. I had survived. More than that, I had won. Not just the legal battle, but the battle for myself. I walked out of that restaurant not as the simple, worthless nobody he had tried to make me, but as Eleanor. Just Eleanor. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like more than enough. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, depositions, and headlines. Preston's trial was the talk of the town, a spectacular fall from grace for one of the city's most prominent businessmen. He was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to a significant prison term. The divorce was finalized, and thanks to the invalidated prenup and the evidence of his extensive financial fraud, the settlement was more than fair. But honestly, that whole spectacle was just background noise to me. The real story, my story, was happening far away from the courtroom. I went back to my first love, teaching. The classroom hummed with energy as my students at Riverside Community College debated the symbolic significance of wealth in The Great Gatsby. I watched them from behind my desk, a quiet joy filling my heart. Dr. Coleman, a bright young woman named Amber, called out from the back row, using my reclaimed maiden name. "Do you think Daisy really loved Gatsby, or just what he represented?" "What an excellent question," I replied, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "What does the text tell us about the difference between a genuine connection and the performance of love?" The discussion bloomed. I was back where I belonged. The skills I'd once used to dismantle my husband's criminal enterprise, close reading, textual analysis, pattern recognition, were now being channeled into nurturing young minds. After class, I headed to the campus coffee shop. I'd established an informal weekly gathering there for female students interested in financial literacy. What had begun as casual conversations had evolved into structured sessions covering everything from compound interest to recognizing financial red flags in relationships. I was determined to give these young women the tools I never had, the knowledge to protect themselves. My phone buzzed with a text from my publisher. They loved the manuscript. My book, Hidden in Plain Sight, A Woman's Guide to Financial Self-Defense, was scheduled for release in the spring. The advance had been modest, but the early interest from women's groups had surprised everyone but me. I knew there were other women out there like me, women who had been made to feel small, who had been underestimated. I was writing for them. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I was setting up for my financial literacy group, I saw a familiar face hovering uncertainly near the coffee shop entrance. It was Sabrina, Preston's former mistress. Our eyes met, and I braced myself for a confrontation. The old Eleanor might have turned away, or offered a brittle, polite dismissal. But I wasn't the old Eleanor anymore. She approached me with visible hesitation, her hands clutching her purse strap. I saw the flyer for your group, she said, avoiding direct eye contact. I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome. She told me her story. Preston had promised her the world, but when his empire crumbled, he left her with nothing but a mountain of debt from the lavish lifestyle he had encouraged. She had been just another asset for him to use and discard. She was a victim of his manipulations, too, albeit in a different way. I considered her request thoughtfully. My anger at her had faded long ago, replaced by a quiet understanding. She was a casualty of the same ego that had tried to destroy me. The group is open to any woman who wants to learn, I replied finally, my voice even. Everyone deserves financial independence. Vanessa nodded gratefully, a flicker of relief in her eyes, and followed me inside where a dozen women of various ages already waited. As I arranged my materials and looked out at the faces in the room, young students, single mothers, and now, the woman who had been part of my greatest pain, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. I saw a woman I almost didn't recognize. Her posture was confident, her gaze was direct. There was no trace of the person who had spent years making herself smaller to accommodate a man's ego. Preston's trial was over, but that was no longer the center of my story. For the first time in years, I was writing my own narrative. Not as a revenge plot or a survival strategy, but as the life I'd always been capable of living, a life of purpose and empowerment. I smiled at the waiting women. All right, everyone, I said, opening my notebook to a fresh, clean page. Let's begin. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means more than you know. If you've ever felt underestimated or unheard, I hope my journey gives you a little bit of strength. Please, if you feel so inclined, share your own thoughts in the comments below. I read them all. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Be well, and be strong.